Robert Hastings had exactly 6 months to live, and the 72-year-old billionaire had only one regret that mattered anymore. Sitting in his penthouse overlooking Manhattan, surrounded by the trappings of a fortune worth $43 billion, he could not stop thinking about a little girl with dark braids and kind eyes who had saved his life 2 decades ago, a child whose name he had never learned, whose face had haunted him through 20 years of searching, and who he desperately needed to find before his heart finally gave out. His team of private investigators had spent millions trying to locate her, searching through hospital records, immigration databases, and orphanage registries across 3 countries, but every lead had gone cold. Every trail had ended in frustration, and now time was running out in a way that all his money could not stop. His daughter Victoria walked into the study that morning with her usual expression of calculated concern, the one she wore whenever she wanted something, and informed him that she had hired a new housekeeper because the previous one had finally quit after Victoria had berated her for folding towels incorrectly. Robert barely registered the information, too lost in his own thoughts, staring at the one photograph he had from that day 20 years ago, grainy and unclear, showing only the back of a young girl running away from the scene of the accident that should have killed him. Victoria continued talking about her charity gala, her new yacht, her plans to expand the Hastings Foundation, but Robert heard none of it, his mind trapped in a memory that had defined the last 2 decades of his life. It had been a cold November evening in 1985, and Robert had been a different man then, 52 years old, recently widowed, drowning his grief in alcohol and reckless behavior that his deceased wife would have been ashamed of. He had been driving too fast on a rain-slicked road outside a small town in upstate New York, trying to outrun his pain, when his car had hydroplaned and crashed through a guardrail, plunging down an embankment into freezing water. He remembered the shock of the cold, the terror as water filled the car, the certainty that he was going to die alone and drunk and pathetic. And then, impossibly, a child's face appearing at the window, small hands pulling at the door with strength that should have been impossible for someone so young. She could not have been more than 8 or 9 years old, this tiny girl in a threadbare coat, and she had dragged him from that sinking car with a determination that defied logic, had performed CPR that she must have learned from television, had stayed with him in the freezing rain until the ambulance arrived, and then, before he could even ask her name, she had disappeared into the darkness like an angel returning to heaven. The paramedics told him later that without her intervention, he would have drowned within minutes. That this mysterious child had given him a second chance at life, and Robert had spent every day since trying to find her, to thank her, to repay a debt that could never truly be settled. He had changed after that night, stopped drinking, rebuilt his company with renewed purpose, tried to become the kind of man worthy of the gift he had been given, but the guilt of never finding his savior had eaten at him for 20 years. Now, with his doctor's words echoing in his mind, congestive heart failure, 6 months at most. Perhaps a year with aggressive treatment. Robert knew he was running out of time to make this right. He called his head of security and gave the same instructions he had given 1,000 times before. Keep searching, expand the parameters, check again. There has to be something we missed, and he heard the same sympathetic tone in the response. We are doing everything we can, sir, we will not give up. Later that afternoon, Maria Reyes arrived for her first day as the new Hastings housekeeper. A quiet woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and work-worn hands. And she brought with her a young woman she introduced as her daughter, Isabella, who was visiting from nursing school and had kindly offered to help her mother on this first day. Robert barely glanced at them as Maria began explaining her previous experience, and Isabella started unpacking cleaning supplies, too absorbed in his own thoughts to pay attention to the staff, a habit Victoria had cultivated in him over the years, treating employees as invisible furniture rather than human beings. Isabella Reyes moved through the penthouse with practiced efficiency, her mother having taught her to clean since she was old enough to hold a dustcloth. But she kept stealing glances at the old man in the study, something about him triggering a memory she could not quite grasp, a feeling of recognition that made no logical sense. She noticed the way he stared at an old photograph, the sadness in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he held the frame, and something in her chest tightened with unexpected sympathy for this stranger, who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Maria had warned her daughter that Victoria Hastings was difficult, demanding, and often cruel, but that they desperately needed this job because the medical bills from Maria's recent surgery had devastated their savings. And Isabella had promised to help her mother for a few weeks, until she had to return to her nursing program. What neither of them knew was that Robert Hastings had been listening to their quiet conversation in Spanish, a language he had learned decades ago for business. And something about Maria's gentle voice and Isabella's protective concern for her mother had stirred a memory he could not quite place. It was 3 days later when everything changed. Isabella was cleaning Robert's study while he worked at his desk, and she accidentally knocked over a stack of folders, sending papers scattering across the expensive carpet, including that precious photograph he kept hidden in his top drawer. She scrambled to collect everything, apologizing profusely in English, tinged with a slight accent, and as she handed him the photograph, their eyes met, and Robert felt something shift in the universe, a recognition so profound it stopped his heart for a dangerous moment. The photograph showed the back of a young girl, dark braids flying as she ran from the accident scene, and Isabella had frozen, staring at the image with an expression of dawning horror and recognition. Robert watched the color drain from her face and asked, in a voice rough with emotion, what was wrong. And Isabella, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the photo again, whispered that she knew this picture, that it could not be, but she knew exactly when and where it had been taken because she had been that girl with the dark braids, running away from the car accident on Route 9 in November of 1985. The silence that followed was so complete that Robert could hear his own heartbeat, irregular and too fast, pounding against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He asked her to repeat what she had just said, certain he had misheard, that his dying heart was playing tricks on him. But Isabella was already pulling out her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through photos until she found one of herself at age 8. Dark braids, gap-toothed smile, wearing the same threadbare coat visible in his grainy photograph, and the resemblance was undeniable, unmistakable, impossible, and yet absolutely real. Robert stood up so fast his chair fell over, decades of carefully controlled emotion crumbling in an instant, and he asked her how, why, what had she been doing on that road that night, and Isabella's story came pouring out in a rush of words she had never told anyone. Her father had just died. She and her mother were driving from New York City to stay with relatives upstate. Their car had broken down on Route 9 in the freezing rain, and while her mother tried to call for help on a payphone, 8-year-old Isabella had wandered toward the sound of a crash, finding a car sinking into a pond, finding a man trapped inside who looked so much like her recently deceased father that she had acted without thinking, pulling him free with strength born of grief and desperation and the absolute certainty that she could not let another person die. She had run away afterward because she was terrified of getting in trouble, because her mother had always taught her to avoid police and authorities who might question their immigration status, because she was just a child who had done something extraordinary and then panicked. They had left that night as soon as a tow truck arrived for their car, and Isabella had never told her mother what had happened, carrying the secret of that night for 20 years, sometimes wondering if she had dreamed the whole thing, if the man she saved had even survived. Robert was crying now, tears streaming down his face in a way he had not allowed since his wife's funeral, and he took Isabella's hands in his and told her that she had saved his life, that he had been searching for her for 20 years, that she was the reason he was still alive, the reason he had become a better man, and that finding her now, in the last months of his life, felt like a gift from a God he had stopped believing in. He called for Maria, who came running at the urgency in his voice, and when he explained who her daughter was, what she had done, Maria collapsed into a chair with her hand over her mouth, staring at Isabella like she was seeing her for the first time. Victoria arrived home to find her father sitting with the housekeeper and her daughter, all of them crying, and she demanded to know what was happening with the kind of imperious anger that came from a lifetime of getting her own way. Robert looked at his daughter, really looked at her perhaps for the first time in years, and saw a woman who had been corrupted by wealth, who treated people as disposable, who had none of the compassion or courage that this remarkable young woman possessed at age 8. He told Victoria the entire story, watched her face cycle through disbelief, shock, and then a calculating expression that made his heart sink with disappointment. Over the following weeks, Robert got to know Isabella, learning about her struggles to put herself through nursing school, her 3 jobs, her dedication to her mother, her dream of working in pediatric emergency medicine because she wanted to save children the way she had once saved a stranger. He was awed by her resilience, her kindness, her absolute lack of bitterness despite a life that had been infinitely harder than it should have been, and he found himself wanting to give her everything, not out of obligation but out of genuine affection for this extraordinary young woman who had grown from that brave child. He changed his will, leaving half his fortune to Isabella and establishing a foundation in her name to provide full scholarships for undocumented students, pursuing medical degrees. And when Victoria found out, she exploded with rage, accusing Isabella of being a con artist, demanding DNA tests, threatening lawsuits. Robert told his daughter calmly that he had already conducted every possible verification, that he had proof beyond any doubt, and that if she could not accept this with grace, she was welcome to challenge the will after he was gone, but she would do so without his respect or blessing. But there was someone else who had been watching this unfold with increasing interest. Robert's godson, Marcus, a 30-year-old cardiac surgeon who had been visiting regularly to check on Robert's deteriorating health. Marcus had known Robert since childhood, had gone into medicine, partly because of Robert's stories about being saved by a mysterious angel, and meeting Isabella felt like destiny clicking into place. He found himself drawn to her strength, her compassion, her brilliant mind that grasped complex medical concepts instantly, and the way she made his godfather laugh for the first time in years. Isabella was wary at first, having learned to distrust the wealthy after years of being invisible to them, but Marcus was different, humble despite his success, passionate about medicine, and he treated her mother with the same respect he showed Robert. They began spending time together when Marcus visited, discussing cases, debating treatment approaches, and slowly, carefully, falling in love in the quiet spaces between conversations about Robert's failing heart. Robert watched this relationship develop with joy and satisfaction, seeing in Marcus the kind of good man Isabella deserved. Someone who valued her for who she was, rather than what she represented. He called them both into his study one evening, looking frailer than ever, and told them that his greatest regret 20 years ago had been not getting the chance to know the brave girl who saved him, but that fate had given him something better, the opportunity to know the remarkable woman she had become, and to see her find happiness with someone worthy of her. His health declined rapidly after that, the doctors giving him weeks rather than months, and Isabella spent every free moment at his bedside, this time saving him in a different way, easing his pain, holding his hand, telling him stories about her childhood and her dreams for the future. Marcus proposed to her on a Tuesday afternoon in Robert's room, with the old man's blessing and encouragement, and when Isabella said yes, through tears of joy and sorrow, Robert smiled with genuine happiness for the first time since his wife had died. Robert Hastings passed away on a Sunday morning with Isabella holding one hand and Marcus holding the other, and his last words were, "Thank you." Not for saving his life 20 years ago, but for showing him that the most important legacy was not money or power, but the connections we make and the lives we touch. At his funeral, Isabella spoke about the man who had spent 20 years searching for her, who had changed his entire life because of one act of childhood bravery, and who had given her not just financial security but something far more valuable, a father figure, a family, and the man she would marry. Victoria contested the will as promised, but the evidence was ironclad, and eventually, she accepted a settlement and disappeared from their lives. Isabella and Marcus married 6 months later in a small ceremony, using part of her inheritance to pay off her medical school debt and her mother's medical bills, and investing the rest in the scholarship foundation that would help hundreds of students achieve their dreams just as she had achieved hers. Years later, when people asked Isabella about the incredible coincidence of ending up working in the home of the man she had saved as a child, she would smile and say that maybe it was not coincidence at all, that maybe some debts transcend time and space, that maybe the universe has a way of bringing people back together when they need each other most, and that the little girl with dark braids who pulled a stranger from a sinking car had no idea she was saving not just his life, but her own future as well. Has someone changed your life without knowing it? Share your story in the comments below. Subscribe because our next story will absolutely wreck you in the most beautiful way. Hit that notification bell now.